The planet Axera 9 was a world of ice and crystal, where the cold never faded. Its sky was a soft blue, and the towering ice mountains sparkled under the twin moons. The people of this world, known as the Iceborn, had bodies as smooth and clear as frozen glass. They moved gracefully through their frost-covered cities, their breath forming tiny snowflakes. In the air, in the heart of the grandest city, stood the palace of Queen Syria and her daughter, Princess Zur. The palace, carved from pure ice, reflected light in 1,000 colors. Inside, Zur sat alone in her chamber, gazing at her reflection in a frozen mirror. She was beautiful even by Iceborn standards, with shimmering silver eyes and lips as blue as deep winter, but no one dared to get close to her. Zero was cursed anyone who kissed her lips turned into solid ice. A life of isolation since childhood. Zira had been different. She could not touch others the way they could touch each other. Her mother had warned her from a young age, "You must never let anyone kiss you, my dear. Your lips are colder than death itself." At first, Zira had not believed it, but as she grew older, she saw the truth. Brave suitors from distant planets had come to court her, each one believing they could break the curse, and each one had failed. The first was a prince from the Firelands, a warrior with a heart as hot as lava. He had kissed her with confidence, only to freeze instantly, his body turning into an unmovable statue. Others followed: a noble from the Sky Kingdom, a scientist from the outer colonies, but all suffered the same fate. Now, no one tried anymore. The people of Harine loved their princess, but they feared her as well. Some whispered that she was meant to be alone forever. Others believed only a chosen one could break the curse, but Zira had stopped hoping. She had accepted her fate. A new visitor one evening, as the cold winds hull outside the palace, news arrived of a visitor from a distant world. He was not a prince, nor a warrior, nor a scholar. He was something far stranger. He was human. The Iceborn had heard of humans before. They were soft creatures, short-lived and warm-blooded, unable to survive in extreme cold. Few had ever stepped foot on Exiron, for they would freeze with moments without protection. But this human named Ray had arrived without fear. He wore a special suit to keep himself warm, but even without it, he did not seem afraid of the freezing air. When he entered the palace, he looked around in awe, fascinated by the beauty of the ice covered world. Zero watched from a distance, curious. He looked so different from her people. His skin was not made of crystal, and his breath did not freeze in the air. There was warmth in his movements, something unfamiliar to her. The first meeting that night during a royal gathering, Ray was introduced to the queen and her court. He bowed politely, his breath misting in the cold. The nobles studied him with interest, but some looked doubtful. "What brings you to our world?" Human Queen Sua asked. "I am an explorer," Rai replied. "I travel to new worlds, learning about different civilizations. Syrian is unlike anything I have ever seen." "You are not afraid of the cold?" one noble asked. Rai smiled. "I feel it, but I don't fear it." Zur, listening from her seat, found herself intrigued. No one had ever spoken of her world like this. Most visitors only talked about survival. This human seemed to admire it. Then, as Rai moved closer, their eyes met for a moment. Everything else faded. Zira felt something strange, something she had never felt before. A warmth, not from the air, but from inside her. It was small, like a single spark in a dark winter, but it was there, and for the first time in her life she wondered, could this human be different? The grand hall of the Iceborn Palace shimmered like a frozen dream. Tall crystal pillars stretched toward the high ceiling, reflecting the soft blue glow of the ice chandeliers. The air was cold and still, but in the center of the room, a warm presence stood. Rai, the human explorer. The nobles of Erin observed him with quiet curiosity. His skin was not made of glass like ice, and his breath did not turn to frost in the air. He was different from them in every way. To the Iceborn, warmth was strange, and humans were nothing more than fragile beings of heat and flesh. Yet Princess Zur could not look away. She sat beside her mother, Queen Sua, watching Ray with an expression that none had ever seen on her face. Before, he was different from the suitors who had come before. He was not here to win her heart nor to test her curse. He was simply here to explore, to understand, and that made him intriguing. A test of the cold. A noble named Varric, tall and proud, stepped forward. His icy blue eyes narrowed as he studied the human. "You claim not to fear the cold, yet you wear a suit to protect yourself. Without it, you would freeze like the rest of your kind. Rai smiled slightly. It's true, without my suit, I wouldn't last long in this environment, but that doesn't mean I fear it. The nobles murmured among themselves. Fear and survival were different things, and this. Human understood that Queen Sira raised her hand, and the whispers stopped tell. Me human, she said, what do you seek on our world? Rai glanced at the queen then. As his brown eyes held no trace of deception. I seek knowledge. I travel to different planets, meeting new people, learning about their ways. CRA-9 is unlike anything I've ever seen. I want to understand it. Zira found herself leaning forward. Slightly, most visitors came for trade, for power, or for adventure, but Rai had come for something else. Understanding, a moment of curiosity. As the evening continued, the Iceborn nobles kept their distance, but Zira could not resist the urge to speak. When the feast was nearly over, she stood from her seat and approached the human. The room fell silent. As she stepped closer, the sound of her heels clicking against the ice floor. Ray turned to face her, his expression calm but curious. You are not like the others who have come here, Zur said softly. Ray chuckled. I suppose not, but you're not like anyone I've met either. A flicker of amusement crossed her face. It was rare for someone to speak to her so directly, without hesitation or fear. Most people treated her with caution, as if she were fragile glass that could shatter, or AO storm that could freeze them with a single breath. Zira hesitated for a moment, then reached out her hand. It was a simple gesture, but one that made the room grow tense. The nobles watched in shock. No one touched the princess without risk. Rai glanced at her outstretched hand, then slowly removed his glove. He placed his warm fingers against her cold skin. A gasp echoed through the hall. Zira expected to see frost spread across his skin, to feel the familiar sensation of ice forming between them, but nothing happened. Ray's fingers remained warm, unaffected. Zira's breath caught in her throat. This was impossible. Her entire life, anyone who touched her skin too long felt the creeping bite of ice, but this human did not shiver, did not flinch. His warmth remained steady and real. Interesting, Ray said with a smile. You cold, but it doesn't hurt. Zira pulled her hand back, her mind racing. Had she finally met someone who was immune to her curse? The start of something new, the nobles whispered among themselves. Shocked by what they had witnessed, Queen Sira remained silent, her expression unreadable. Only Varric looked displeased, his sharp gaze fixed on Ray. Enough for tonight, the queen finally said. The human will be our guest. We'll see if his presence brings knowledge or danger. As the court dispersed, Zira stole one last glance at Rai. He was smiling, completely unaware of how much had changed in that single moment. For the first time in her life, Zira felt something stir within her. Hope. The frozen halls of the palace were quiet, but Princess Zirk's mind was restless. She sat by the tall glass window, staring at the endless ice plains of Acherine. The twin moons cast a pale glow over the land, making the ice sparkle like a sea of stars. Yet Zira did not see the beauty of her world tonight. Her thoughts were filled with only one thing: the human. Ray. No one had ever touched her without freezing. No one had ever been immune to her curse. Yet Rai had placed his warm hand on hers, and nothing had happened. It was impossible. It defied everything she had known about herself. She needed to know more. A meeting in the frozen garden. The next morning, Zur sent a quiet message to Rai, asking him to meet her in the royal garden. The garden was a place of beauty where crystal-like trees stretched toward the sky, their branches covered in delicate frost flowers. Rai arrived wrapped in his protective suit, but the cold did not seem to bother him much. He looked around, fascinated by the frozen plants that glowed softly under the morning light. You wanted to see me? He asked as he turned toward her. Zira hesitated. No one had ever made her nervous before. She had always been strong, untouchable, but this human was different. I need to understand, she said finally. Why did you not freeze? Ray shrugged. I don't know, maybe humans are just built differently. Zur frowned. That answer was not enough. She stepped closer, her silver eyes studying him carefully. There is only one way to be sure, she said softly. Rai raised an eyebrow. And what's that? Zira took a deep breath. Then, before she could change her mind, she removed one of her gloves and reached out, placing her cold fingers against his cheek. The moment her skin touched his, a shiver ran through her, but it was not from the cold. It was something else, something unfamiliar. Rai did not flinch. He did not freeze. His skin remained warm under her fingertips. Zira's heart Pounded in her chest. It's true, she whispered, you really are different, Rye. Smiled slightly. I guess I am the nobles' challenge. Their moment of discovery was interrupted by a sharp voice. So the rumors are true, Zur, and Rye turned to see Varric, one of the most powerful nobles of the Iceborne court. He stood tall, his icy blue eyes filled with suspicion. He had never liked the human, and now his dislike had turned into something stronger, jealousy. The cursed princess has finally found someone who can touch her, Varric said coldly. But is he worthy of such an honor? Zira narrowed her eyes. This is none of your concern, Varric. But Varric ignored her. He stepped forward, staring directly at Rye. You think you are special because you do not freeze, he smirked. Then prove your strength. Face me in a challenge. Ray blinked a challenge. Zur sighed, already knowing where this was going. The Iceborne nobles valued strength and skill. When one felt threatened, they demanded a duel. It was their way of settling disputes. You don't have to do this, Zira told Rye quietly. You're a guest here. But Rye smiled. I've never backed down from a challenge before. Zira looked at him in surprise. Most outsiders would have refused. Most would have been afraid. But Rye was different. The first trial later that day, the challenge was set. The court gathered in the arena, a massive space carved from pure ice. The walls shimmered like frozen waterfalls, and the ground was as smooth as a mirror. Rye stood on one side, dressed in lighter clothing now, as he had begun to adjust to the cold. Across from him, Varric stood tall, his breath turning to frost in the air. He held two thin ice-forged blades, his expression calm and confident. Rye had no weapon. Zur stepped forward. The rules are simple, she said. The duel lasts until one of you yields. No fatal strikes. Varric smirked. This won't take long. Ray rolled his shoulders, looking relaxed. Let's see about that. The battle begins the moment the duel started. Varric moved fast, too fast. He was an Iceborne built for speed and precision. In the frozen air, his blade sliced through the air, aiming to strike Ray down quickly. But Ray dodged. He was not as fast as Varric, but he was smart. He watched his opponent's movements, reading his attacks. When Varric lunged again, B-side stepped at the last second, causing the noble to stumble slightly. The crowd murmured in surprise. The human was not weak. Varric growled in frustration and attacked harder. Ray ducked, rolled, and countered, not with strength, but with strategy. He used the smooth ice to slide out of reach, staying just out of Varric's range. The duel was over. The Iceborne nobles murmured among themselves, their breath turning to mist in the cold air. No one had expected a human, soft, warm, and seemingly fragile, to defeat Varric, one of their finest warriors. Yet Ray had done it, and he had done it without weapons. Princess Zura watched as Ree stood in the center of the arena, breathing heavily, but smiling. He was different from anyone she had ever met. He was not the strongest nor the fastest, but he had something else: intelligence, confidence, and something deeper, warmth. The Iceborne were a cold race, not just in body, but in their emotions. They valued control, logic, and strength. Yet Ray was something new, something unpredictable, something she wanted to understand. An unspoken challenge. As Ray left the arena, the nobles watched him with a mix of respect and curiosity. Some still doubted him, but none could deny that he was special. Varric, though humiliated, simply gave Ray a cold glare before storming off. He had lost, and the laws of the Iceborne meant he could not challenge Ray again, at least not openly. Zira walked beside Ray as they returned to the palace. She glanced at him, noticing how relaxed he was despite what had just happened. You surprised them, she said. Ray smirked. I get that a lot. Zira hesitated for a moment before speaking again. You didn't have to accept the challenge. Ray shrugged. Maybe, but I wanted to prove something, not just to them, but to you. Zira felt her chest tighten. She had spent her entire life believing no one could ever truly be close to her, but Ray was different. He had already touched her without freezing. He had faced an Iceborne warrior without fear, and deep inside she felt something she had never dared to feel before: hope, a night of curiosity. That evening, the palace was quiet. The nobles had returned to their chambers, and the cold winds of Erin howled outside. Zur sat in the grand library, surrounded by ancient books made of thin crystal sheets. She was not reading. Her mind was too distracted. She thought of Ray, his warm touch, his fearless attitude, his presence that felt like a fire in a world of ice. A soft knock on the door made her look up. Ray stood there, his brown eyes filled with curiosity. Couldn't sleep. Zira shook her head. No, you. Ray chuckled. Not really too much to think about. He stepped inside, glancing at the books around them. Your world is incredible. Everything is so different. Zur studied him for a moment. And yet you do not seem afraid of it. Ray met her gaze. Maybe because I've seen something even more incredible. Zur felt her heartbeat quicken. No one had ever looked at her the way Rai did. No fear, no hesitation, only understanding. A sudden thought entered her mind, a thought she had never dared to consider before. What if he could truly be different? The impossible moment. Without thinking, Zira stood up and stepped closer to Ray. The warmth from his body brushed against her cold skin, sending a strange sensation through her. She hesitated. No one had ever survived touching her lips. Everyone who had tried had turned into ice, but Rai had already broken every rule. She whispered, I have spent my whole life believing that no one could be close to me. Rai looked into her eyes, his voice soft. Then let me prove that's not true. Zira took a deep breath, then slowly, carefully, she leaned forward, and she kissed him. For a single second, the world seemed to freeze. She expected to feel the familiar sensation of frost spreading, of ice forming, of another person lost to her curse, but nothing happened. Ray remained warm against her lips. Zira gasped, pulling back in shock. She touched his face, searching for any sign of ice, but he was completely fine. He was smiling. It didn't work, she whispered. Ray laughed softly. Or maybe it worked in a way no one expected. Zira's hands trembled. This was impossible. No one could kiss her and live, yet Ray had done it. She wasn't cursed, she wasn't untouchable, and for the first time in her life she was not alone. Zur stood frozen, her silver eyes wide with shock. She had missed Ray, and he had not turned into ice. Her whole life she had believed she was cursed, that no one could ever touch her, that she would always be alone, but now standing before her was a human who had done the impossible. Had broken the curse. Her heart pounded. How is this possible? She whispered. Rai smiled, touching his lips thoughtfully. I don't know, but I think we just proved something big. Zira lifted her hand and placed it against Ray's chest, feeling the warmth beneath his skin. Still, there was no freezing, no ice creeping over his body. He was completely fine. She felt a strange sensation inside her: relief, joy, and fear all mixed together. She was not untouchable. She was not a danger to everyone. But why? The Queen's warning before they could speak more. A sudden voice interrupted them. You must not let anyone see this. Zur and Ray turned sharply. Queen Syria stood at the entrance of the library, her expression unreadable. She had seen everything. Zira stepped forward. Mother, did you see what happened? Rai, he didn't freeze. The Queen's cold gaze shifted to Rai. I saw. Ray cleared his throat. Boo, is that a bad thing? Queen Syria remained silent for a moment, then sighed. Come with me, both of you. She led them through the palace, down a long hidden corridor that Zur had never seen before. The air grew colder, and the ice walls shimmered with an eerie glow. At the end of the corridor stood a massive door covered in ancient symbols. With a wave of her hand, the Queen unlocked it. Inside was a chamber of ice statues. Zira gasped. She recognized them immediately, the ones who had kissed her and turned to ice: the Fire Prince, the Sky Noble, the many others who had tried to break her curse. They stood frozen, their faces locked in eternal expressions of shock. Ray's eyes widened. Whoa! Queen Sarat turned to Zur. Do you know why they froze? Zur shook her head. Because of my curse. The Queen's expression softened slightly. It was never a curse, my child. Zurk breath caught what Queen Syria stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. There is something you do not know, something I have kept hidden. She turned to Rai. And now, because of you, the truth must be told, the truth of the Iceborn. The Queen waved her hand, and the ice walls shimmered, revealing moving images, memories of the past long ago, that the Iceborn were not as they were now. They had once been like other species, warm and full of life, but over time, as their planet grew colder, they adapted. Their bodies became part of the ice, their blood turning to frozen crystal. But there was one great price: they could no longer be close to outsiders. The Iceborn's touch could freeze others, and their lips carried the final touch of frost, a kiss that turned anyone to ice. Zur trembled. Then why didn't Ray freeze? Queen Syria's gaze rested on Ray. Because humans are different. They are the only ones whose warmth cannot be stolen by the Iceborn. The fire in their blood resists our cold. Zera's heart raced. That means I was never Cursed, the queen nodded. You were never meant to be alone, Zur. You only needed to find the right person, a dangerous secret. Zur turned to Ray, her emotions overwhelming her. He had changed everything. He had freed her from a lifetime of fear. Ray grinned. Well, that explains a lot, but Queen Sira's expression darkened. No one must know. Zira blinked while the queen turned to the frozen statues. If the nobles learn that a human can survive your kiss, they will not see it. As a miracle, they will see it as a threat. Ray frowned. A threat? Why? Because power is everything in our world, the queen said, and the idea that a human is immune to the Iceborne's strongest force, it will create fear, and fear leads to war. Zur clenched her fists. She had just found freedom, and now she was being told to hide it. Ray placed a hand on her shoulder. We'll figure this out together. Zira met his gaze, war warm, strong, unafraid. She had been alone her whole life, but now she had someone by her side, and no matter what dangers lay ahead, she was not alone anymore. Zira could barely sleep that night. The truth about her so-called curse kept echoing in her mind. She had never been cursed. She had simply been born in a world that did not understand her, and Ray was the proof that she was not untouchable. She sat by her window, staring at the twin moons of Erin. Somewhere in the palace, Rai was sleeping, unaware of the storm his presence had started. The Iceborne nobles were already suspicious of him. If they discovered that he was immune to her ice, things could turn dangerous. Her mother's warning was clear. The truth must remain hidden, but how long could she keep such a secret? A visit in the shadows. A sudden knock at her door made her turn. It was Rai. Couldn't sleep, he asked with a small smile. Zur shook her head. Too many thoughts. Ray leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. Yeah, finding out you're not actually cursed can do that to a person. Zira sighed, rubbing her temples. My whole life, I believe I was dangerous, that I could never be close to anyone, but now I know the truth and I still can't do anything about it. Ray frowned. Why not? Because my mother says it would bring chaos. If the nobles find out that you survived my kiss, they will see you as a threat. They fear what they do not understand. Ray was silent for a moment, then shrugged. So let them fear. Fear only has power if we let it control us. Zur looked at him, surprised. You don't understand how my people think. Ray met her gaze, and maybe that's the problem. The gathering of nobles the next morning. The palace was filled with tension. Queen Syria had called for a gathering of the nobles, and Zur had a feeling she knew why. Dressed in her royal robes, she sat beside her mother on the high throne as the nobles entered the grand hall. Ray stood at the back watching carefully. Queen Sia raised a hand and the room fell silent. There is a matter we must discuss, she said. The presence of the human in our court. A murmur spread through the crowd. Varric stepped forward, his cold eyes locked on Rai. This outsider has already disrupted our ways. He should not be allowed to stay. Rai sighed, crossing his arms. You're still mad about losing that duo? A few nobles chuckled, but Varric's expression darkened. The Iceborne have ruled this world for centuries. We do not need a warm-blooded stranger interfering in our traditions. Zur felt anger rise inside her. Ray has done nothing wrong. Varric gaze turned to her. Princess, you are young. You do not understand how dangerous outsiders can be. We have seen what happens when foreign rulers interfere with our ways. They bring destruction. Zur clenched her fists. Not all outsiders are the same. Ray has only shown us respect and curiosity. That is not a crime. Queen Sua watched the exchange carefully. She could see the growing tension in the room. Enough, the queen said firmly. Ray will remain as our guest. There is no need for fear. Varric did not argue further, but the look in his eyes made it clear he was not done with this fight. A hidden threat. That evening, Zira and Ray walked through the palace gardens. The cold wind rushed against them, but Ray no longer seemed to mind. He's going to try something, Rai muttered. Zira nodded. Varric does not trust outsiders, and now because you won, they